There's a particular kind of silence that lives in dying land. Not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning or the hush after snowfall. This is different. This is the silence of absence, of birds that stopped coming, of creek beds that cracked and curled at the edges like old paper, of cattle that leaned against fence posts because they'd stopped having a reason to walk anywhere. I've heard that silence in a dozen places across my life. Followed it into valleys that used to flood and found nothing but pale, chalky soil and the ghosts of water lines on canyon walls. I've seen men lose ranches to that silence. Good men. Men who worked from before dawn to well after dark and still couldn't outrun what was happening to the land beneath them. So when a colleague of mine, a land assessor named Grady Polk, who never exaggerated anything, not once in the 20 years I'd known him, told me there was a woman over near the Mescalero Flats who'd bought 50 half-feral goats for $2 and was now sitting on what some people were whispering might be a rediscovered spring, I almost didn't go. Almost. I'm a field recorder, have been for most of my adult life. I carry a leather journal wherever I go, the spine cracked and retaped so many times it looks like something a field surgeon worked on. I write down what I see, not what I'm supposed to see, not what makes a tidy story, but what's actually there. And what Grady described didn't sound tidy. It sounded strange and unlikely and too specific to be invented. 50 goats. $2, a strange patch of ground. I drove out there on a Thursday in late October, with a thermos of coffee and my journal on the passenger seat. And what I found, what I watched unfold over the following weeks, is the reason I still believe that land remembers things. That people do too. And that sometimes the most important discoveries in a person's life don't come from intelligence or planning or money. Sometimes they come from stubbornness, a borrowed instinct, and the strange behavior of goats. The first time I saw Nadia Runningwaiter, she was standing in the middle of a cracked, pale field arguing with a goat. Not the casual argument people have with difficult animals, the muttered cursing, the push, the resigned surrender. This was a full negotiation. She was crouched at the goat's level, one hand on her knee, the other gesturing at a spot of ground a few feet to the right of where the animal kept nosing. The goat, a narrow-chested white-tan thing with one ear that flopped sideways like a broken shutter, wasn't interested in her opinion. It kept returning to the same spot, dropping its muzzle huffing. She kept pointing elsewhere. I'd parked my truck off the county road and walked maybe a quarter mile along a wire fence line before I found her. The land on both sides of that fence was the same, pale, cracked caliche flats with a fringe of mesquite and a few cholla cactus standing in the middle distance like sentinels who'd given up caring. A thin line of mountains sat on the horizon to the west, purple and indifferent. The sky was cloudless in a way that felt punishing rather than beautiful. I stopped a respectable distance away and wrote in my journal, woman late 30s or early 40s, Apache from the look of her or part, short. Dark hair under a canvas hat, arguing with a goat. The goat is winning. She noticed me about 30 seconds later. Straightened up, pulled the hat brim down like she was shading her eyes even though I wasn't standing anywhere near the sun. You the one Grady sent, she called. He suggested I come, I'm not sure he sent me. Same thing with Grady? She looked back at the goat, which had returned to its spot with the patience of something that had already decided it was right. Come here if you're coming. Mind the fence section on your left. It's loose and it'll grab your boots. I minded the fence section, stepped through a gap she'd indicated with a small wave, and crossed toward her. Up close she was younger than I'd initially guessed, 35 maybe, though the sun and the dry wind had been at her face long enough to put a few years on her that weren't hers yet. She had narrow, watchful eyes and the kind of stillness in her posture that comes from spending a lot of time in places where stillness is practical. Nadia, she said, and held out a hand. Callum Breckenridge, I write field records. Grady thought what you're doing out here might be worth documenting. What I'm doing out here, she repeated, and there was a faint quality to her voice that I couldn't immediately name, not mockery exactly, but a kind of awareness that words and reality don't always match cleanly. What am I doing out here in your estimation? Honestly, I'm not sure yet. Grady mentioned goats and a spring, but he was vague on the details. Grady's always vague on details. It's his way of not being wrong. She looked at the field around us, and I followed her eyes. 50-some animals were scattered across the pale ground in loose clusters, goats of several sizes and at least 4 color variations. Some were grazing on almost nothing, nibbling at dry, fibrous scrub that I wouldn't have thought had any nutrition left in it. Others were doing what the flop-tier one was doing, standing in particular spots, dropping their noses, occasionally pawing the ground. "I bought this parcel 8 months ago," Nadia said. 43 acres of what the county assessor's office officially describes as degraded rangeland, limited viability. I paid $1,100 for it. "That's cheap." "That's not cheap. That's what land costs when 3 previous owners tried to run cattle on it, and all 3 gave up inside of 4 years. She said it matter-of-factly, without drama. Before them, it was listed as inactive Apache allotment. Before that, the records go quiet. I wrote that down. Inactive Apache allotment, records go quiet. "And the goats?" I asked. She almost smiled. It was the kind of expression that started and then reconsidered, like a sentence that gets rewritten before it's finished. "The goats came from a man named Ernie Delacroix. He runs a small farm about 12 miles east. Had a disease move through part of his herd earlier this year, lost about 60 animals. The ones that survived weren't in great condition, and he didn't have the resources to properly care for 50 of them through the winter. He asked me if I wanted them." She paused for $2. $2 for 50 goats. He needed the paperwork transfer more than the money, tax reasons. She looked at me steadily. "I know how it sounds. It sounds like you got 50 goats for $2. I got 50 half-feral goats in uncertain health on land that 3 cattle ranchers already gave up on in October." She swept a hand at the surrounding flatness. "Nobody was lining up to congratulate me." I looked at the animals again. They did not look like a fortunate acquisition. Several were visibly thin. A few moved with a slight hesitation that might have been old injury or residual illness. The flop-tier one had given up on Nadia's input entirely and was now standing on its chosen patch of ground with the satisfied expression of an animal that had made a decision and was committed to it. "What made you say yes?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the mesquite and made a dry, rattling sound. A hawk crossed overhead so high it was barely a mark. "My grandmother used to say that goats know things about land that people have forgotten," she said. She wasn't being mystical, she meant it practically. They graze differently than cattle. They move differently. They're not trying to find the best grass, they'll eat anything. But when they stop eating and just stand somewhere, that's different. She looked at the flop-tier goat. That means they found something. I looked at the spots where several animals were standing, noses down. "What do you think they found?" "I think I'll know more in a few days," she said. "I've been watching the clustering pattern for 2 weeks. They're not random. They keep coming back to the same patches." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a rough hand-drawn map of the 43 acres, with small X marks in 7 or 8 locations. "These are the spots that get the most return visits." The X marks formed a rough crescent shape across the lower third of the property. Something about the shape of it made me stop writing for a moment. She noticed, "You see something." "Maybe nothing," I said. "That shape, is there any low ground at the center of that crescent, like a dry basin or a depression?" She looked at the map for a long moment, then looked up at the land ahead of us. "There's a patch," she said slowly. "About 120 yards in that direction. The ground is a different color. Pale clay instead of the regular caliche. I noticed it when I first walked the property." "Have you dug there?" "Not yet. I was waiting to see if the goats would confirm it." I looked at the flop-tier goat, standing patient and decided on its chosen square of earth. "I think," I said carefully, "that the goats might be confirming something." Her name, I learned later that first day, was Nadia Tsalagi Running Waiter, and the middle name came from her grandmother, a Mescalero Apache woman named Tsalagi who had spent her entire adult life on and adjacent to lands very much like this one. Nadia had grown up in Alamogordo, 40 miles away, and had worked for 18 years in land remediation, the slow, technical work of trying to restore degraded soil to something livable. She'd done it for a state agency, then for a nonprofit, then for a private environmental consulting firm, and all 3 times the funding had eventually dried up the way everything dried up in this region. She'd left the consulting firm 14 months ago. Not fired, she was careful to say that, but the project she'd been running, a multi-year soil restoration effort on former grazing land north of Ruidoso, had lost its federal grant renewal. The project ended. She'd walked away with severance and a growing certainty that the kind of careful, institutional, grant-dependent work she'd been doing was never going to move fast enough for the land that needed it. "The land doesn't wait," she said. We were sitting on the tailgate of her truck by then, late afternoon, sharing coffee from her thermos because I'd already finished mine. "The soil goes. The seed bank goes. The water table drops. And then you come back in 10 years with a remediation plan and a budget, and you discover that the timeline for recovery is now 40 years instead of 15, because you waited. So you bought the worst land you could find." "I bought land that I thought still had something left in it," she corrected me without sharpness. "There's a difference. Land that's completely dead doesn't have a particular smell. This land has a smell, faint. You have to get low and close. But it's there." I'd been a field recorder for long enough to know that this kind of statement, "the land has a smell," was either the beginning of a useful insight or the beginning of someone convincing themselves of something that wasn't there. I'd seen both. I wasn't sure yet which this was. "What does it smell like?" I asked. She thought about it. "Like the underside of a rock after rain. That cold, mineral, slightly green smell, not strong, but it doesn't fit the surface." I wrote that down too. That evening, before I drove back to my motel in Chilarosa, I walked the property boundary with her. The 43 acres were not impressive to look at. The caliche crust was hard and white in most places, broken only where the goats had been working, and the goat-worked ground already looked subtly different, I noticed. Looser, more textured, not dramatically, but enough that you could see where the animals had been. The pale clay patch she'd mentioned was set into a slight natural depression, not a dramatic bowl, nothing that would appear on a standard topographical map, but a gradual, maybe 8-inch drop across 30 or 40 feet of ground. The clay was indeed a different color from the surrounding soil, lighter, almost silvery in the late sun, with a surface texture that looked very slightly compressed, as though something had been moving through it from below. I crouched down and pressed my palm flat against the clay. It was, almost imperceptibly, cooler than the surrounding ground. Not by much, maybe 2 degrees, maybe less, I might have imagined it. I looked up at Nadia, who was watching me with an expression I recognized from field work, the face of someone who has been noticing something for a long time and is waiting to see if anyone else notices it too. "Yeah," I said, "I feel it." She nodded once, like a decision had been confirmed. We didn't say anything else about it that evening, but when I drove away, I wrote 7 words in my journal before I put the truck in gear. "The ground here is still alive, barely." The following days developed with the slow, irregular rhythm of field observation, which is to say, mostly nothing happened, and the nothing that happened was full of detail. I came back 3 mornings in a row. I watched the goats. I walked the property with Nadia at different times of day, watching how the light changed the ground, how the temperature of the clay patch shifted between morning and afternoon. I wrote descriptions of individual animals. The flop-tier goat I'd started privately calling Arbitrator, because of its decisive manner. A large, dark-coated one that the others seemed to defer to. A small brown kid that kept getting separated from its mother and standing at the fence line with an expression of pure inconvenience. On the 3rd morning, Nadia brought a soil probe, a simple metal rod with a T-handle, and began working the clay patch. I should say she was not a reckless person. She'd spent 18 years doing land remediation professionally. She knew how to probe soil, how to read resistance, how to identify the difference between compressed dry clay and clay with moisture beneath it. She worked methodically, starting at the outer edge of the depression and moving inward in a grid pattern. I watched and wrote. On the 9th probe insertion, approximately at the center of the depression, she stopped. Pulled the rod out, looked at it. Drove it back in, deeper this time. Pulled it out and held it toward me. The lower 4 inches of the probe were damp. Not soaked, not dripping, but unmistakably, undeniably damp in a way that no surface soil in this region was damp in October after 6 weeks without rain. She didn't say anything for a long moment. The Arbitrator was standing 12 feet away, watching us with its head tilted slightly, as though supervising. "Okay," Nadia said finally. Her voice was carefully even. "Okay." "How far down?" I asked. "Less than 3 feet. That's shallower than I expected." She looked at the probe in her hand. "Much shallower." Is that good? If it's continuous, she said. If it's fed, if it's not just a trapped pocket. She turned and looked toward the mountains on the western horizon, then back down at the ground. There used to be springs all through this basin. The old survey maps, I have ones from the 1880s, they show 6 or 7 named springs within a 20-mile radius. Almost all of them are listed as dry or inactive by 1940. Lost to drought. Lost to overuse, she said. Cattle in numbers the land couldn't support. Homestead-era water diversion. Springs don't die from drought mostly. They get cut off. The recharge pathway gets disrupted. The land compacts, the water can't sink in to recharge the aquifer, and gradually the spring goes quiet. She looked at the probe again at those 4 damp inches. But sometimes quiet isn't dead. She drove the probe in a second time, 2 inches to the left. Pulled it out, 4 inches damp. A third time, 4 inches damp. Her hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. Mine weren't either, and I was just the person writing it down. By the end of part 1, I had filled 19 pages of my journal and had drunk enough of Nadia's coffee to owe her a full canister. The picture that was assembling itself from my notes was this: a woman with a professional background in land remediation, a personal inheritance of place knowledge from an Apache grandmother, and 18 years of watching institutional approaches fail had made a bet that most people would call eccentric at best. She'd bought land everyone else had given up on, accepted animals everyone else didn't want, and begun watching those animals with the patient attention of someone who believed that living things understood the land better than instruments did. And the instruments, at least the probe, were beginning to agree with the goats. I called Grady Polk that evening. "You were right," I said. "This is worth documenting." "Told you," he said, and I could hear the particular satisfaction of a man who has been correctly vague. "How far along is she?" "She found moisture at 3 feet, dead center of the depression." A pause. That's actually interesting." "Yes, Grady, that's actually interesting." "Is she going to dig?" "I think," I said, looking at my notes, at those 19 pages of a woman who argued with a goat and lost, and then went right ahead and started probing the ground with quiet, relentless precision, "that she's been digging this whole time. We just couldn't see it." He didn't have anything to say to that, which was, for Grady, a kind of high praise. I drove back to the motel. The mountains were black cutouts against a sky full of cold stars. I wrote one more line in my journal before I turned the light off. She didn't buy the goats because she had a plan. She bought the goats because she trusted something older than plans. I wasn't sure yet if that was true, but it was what the first week looked like from where I was standing, and I've learned, over a lot of field years, to write what you see and let it tell you later what it means. The second week started with cold. Not the crisp, clear cold of high-country autumn. This was the flat, gray cold of a weather system that had stalled somewhere over New Mexico and couldn't decide whether to become a proper storm or just sit there being miserable. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight. The clay patch in Nadia's depression developed a thin, white frost by morning that made it look, briefly, almost beautiful. I drove out early before 7 and found her already there. She was crouched at the edge of the depression with a thermos and a notebook of her own, writing something I didn't try to read. 3 goats were standing in the depression with her, including the arbitrator, who had apparently decided that cold was not a reason to change one's position. She looked up when I came through the fence gap. "Frost melted faster here," she said by way of greeting. "In the depression, I timed it. 8 minutes faster than the surrounding ground." I looked at the surrounding soil, still white frosted in the flat morning light, and at the depression, which was indeed already showing bare clay in the center. "That's geothermal. That's groundwater proximity," she said. "Water holds heat. If there's water close enough to the surface, the ground above it stays marginally warmer. Frost melts faster." She stood, stretched her back. "It's not proof, but it's consistent." I sat down on a cold, flat rock and opened my journal. "What happens next? Are you going to hire a hydrologist?" She was quiet for a moment, pouring coffee. "I did contact a hydrologist," she said, "through the state university. They said it sounded promising, and they'd put me on their assessment list." She handed me a cup. "Their current wait time for site visits is 14 months. I took the coffee. 14 months. The funding for the field assessment program was cut 2 years ago. There are 3 hydrologists doing the work of 9. So what do you do? I do what I can do. She said it without self-pity, without drama, the way you say things you've already made peace with. I have a soil probe. I have a water table reference guide from 1974 that was the best resource for this basin before the newer ones made it obsolete. I have the goats, and I have a man named Eulalio Chavez. Who's Eulalio Chavez? She almost smiled again. He's 81 years old. He grew up on land 6 miles from here. His grandfather built a home on land that had a working spring on it, a spring that went dry sometime in the 1950s. He knows this basin the way a person knows a room they grew up in. She looked toward the road. He's coming this afternoon. Eulalio Chavez arrived at 2:15 in a truck that had to be 30 years old and sounded like it was running on willpower and seasonal goodwill. He was a small, compact man with white hair cut close to his head and hands that looked like they'd been weathered by about 80 years of exactly the kind of work his hands showed. He wore a canvas jacket, clean work boots, and a belt buckle that depicted, I gradually made out, a running horse. He walked with a cane he didn't entirely seem to need. He moved too steadily for it to be structural, but he used it as a probe, tapping the ground occasionally as he walked, as though checking something. Nadia greeted him in Spanish first, then English. He answered in English with an accent that was more East New Mexico than anything else, flat and unhurried. You found the wet spot, he said. It wasn't a question. Center of the low ground, Nadia said. About 3 feet down, moisture consistent on repeated probing. He grunted and began walking toward the depression without further preamble. I fell into step behind them, notebook open. At the edge of the depression, Eulalio stopped. He looked at the pale clay. He tapped his cane on the ground twice, short, decisive taps, and then moved around the edge to a different position, the north side, and tapped again. You know what this is? He asked Nadia. I have a hypothesis. Not a hypothesis, he pointed with the cane. You see how the clay runs that direction? He traced a line with the cane tip, a slightly elevated ridge of clay that I hadn't noticed before, running roughly northwest to southeast along the upper edge of the depression. That's old channel material. Water ran through here, a long time ago, but not so long that the ground forgot. The channel silted over, compacted, the water went underground, but it didn't go away. He looked at her. Your grandmother's land, Tsalaga's land, that was up toward Perdido Creek, yes. Northeast of here, about 9 miles. There were springs up that way, 3 that I knew of personally. One of them fed a family for 2 generations. He paused. Tsalagi would have known this basin. She did, Nadia said quietly. She talked about it. I didn't understand what she meant when I was young. What did she say? She called it the place that remembers water. I thought it was something poetic. Nadia looked at the pale clay ground. I think she was describing something literal. Eulalio made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite agreement, something in between. He crouched down slowly, carefully, but he got there and pressed his palm flat against the clay. The same thing I'd done on the first day. He held it there for about 20 seconds. Then he stood. 3 feet is too shallow for this kind of formation, he said. I don't think that's the water table. I think that's a clay lens, a horizontal layer of clay that's been holding trapped water above the main aquifer. If there's a spring here, the actual vent will be deeper, and it won't be in the center of the low ground. He turned and pointed. It'll be to the west, maybe 15, 20 yards, where the old channel would have entered the basin from the foothills. Nadia and I both looked west, where the ground rose slightly, barely perceptibly, toward the far fence line. You're saying the spring might be upslope from the depression? I asked. Springs don't always flow into the lowest ground, he said patiently, as one explains something obvious. They emerge where the water finds a break in the confining layer. If the confining layer here is the old clay channel bed, then the break, the vent, would be where that channel meets a change in the substrate. He tapped his cane on the ground again. I spent 60 years running cattle and growing chili on this type of ground. You learn where the water goes. Nadia was already moving west, probe in hand. I wrote, the old man taps the ground. The woman moves toward the place he pointed. The goats have been standing there since yesterday. Because they had 4 of them, including the arbitrator, who had relocated from the center of the depression to a position about 18 yards west-northwest, and had been there on and off for 2 days. The probing that followed over the next 2 hours was the kind of work that looks like nothing from the outside. a woman methodically inserting a metal rod into the ground at intervals, while an old man watched and occasionally redirected her with a word or a cane point. But the tension in it was real. I could feel it the way you feel weather changing, a building pressure in the air, a sense that something was about to either confirm itself or collapse. The moisture at 3 feet, the clay lens, as Eulalio had identified it, ran in a consistent band from the depression center about 10 yards in each direction. It was holding water the way a bathtub holds water, not the way a spring delivers it. But at 17 yards west of the center, in a spot where a slight rise in the ground barely registered visually, the probe went in differently. Not just damp, wet. Nadia pulled the probe out and held it, and water beaded on the lower 6 inches. Not dripped, beaded, the way water does when it's coming from something under pressure. She pushed it back in, pulled it out. The same. Here, she said. Eulalio walked over, looked at the probe, looked at the ground, and then looked at the mountains to the west. Here, he agreed. She marked the spot with a small wooden stake she'd brought in her jacket. Then she marked 3 spots in a circle around it. Then she stepped back and looked at the marked ground and the pale mountains beyond it with an expression I found, when I tried to describe it later, nearly impossible to write accurately. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief exactly, though there was some of that. It was more like the expression of someone who has been listening very carefully to something for a very long time, in a language they only partially understand, and has finally heard a word they recognize. What do you need to open it? I asked. A hand auger first, to get a clean bore and confirm the depth and flow rate. She looked at the stake. Then probably a backhoe to clear the compacted surface material. Then casing, perforated steel to keep the bore clean while the surrounding soil restabilizes. She was ticking through the list with professional practicality. It'll take help, and money I don't have yet. How much? To do it right, equipment rental, materials, labor if I hire anyone, probably $1,400, $1,500. She said it without bitterness, which somehow made it more affecting. She'd spent $1,100 for the land. She'd spent $2 for the goats. And now the thing those investments had led her to would cost another $1,500 to actually realize. I have about $400, she said, in the account I'm using for this project. She said it simply as a fact, and then she moved on, picked up her probe, began marking the surrounding area for further testing. That was the thing about Nadia Runningwaiter that I kept running up against. She had the gift of acknowledging a problem without letting the acknowledgement eat the ground she was standing on. The money was a problem. The problem needed solving. She would solve it or she wouldn't, but she wasn't going to spend energy on the emotional cost of it while there was still work to do. Eulalio was watching her with an expression that I recognized after a moment. Admiration of the specifically careful kind, the kind that comes from someone who has worked hard their whole life watching someone else work hard. My granddaughter, he said quietly, not to Nadia, just into the air, she's a civil engineer in Albuquerque. She does water infrastructure assessments for municipalities. He paused. She has a hand auger she's never going to use again, and she has colleagues. Nadia stopped probing and looked at him. I can call her, he said. No promises. Nadia looked back at the wooden stake in the ground for a long moment. Thank you, Eulalio. Don't thank me, thank the goats. They did the surveying. I want to write honestly about the emotional texture of those days, because I think there's a version of this story, the easy version, that would make what was happening feel inevitable. Found the spring, got the help, the water flowed, everything was fine. But that's not what it felt like from inside it. What it felt like was precarious. Every day that week I drove out to the property and watched Nadia work, and every day I felt the particular anxiety of watching someone bet their remaining resources on something that was not yet confirmed. The moisture in the probe was real. Eulalio's reading of the formation was experienced and specific. The goat's behavior was, I had come to believe, genuinely informative. But none of it was the water itself. None of it was a flowing spring. None of it was proof. And Nadia knew that better than anyone. She'd done land remediation long enough to know how many promising formations turned out to be trapped pockets, isolated moisture, geological cul-de-sacs that went nowhere. She told me about 3 of them, specific projects, specific sites, specific moments of hope that had caved in on themselves. How do you keep going after something like that? I'd asked. She'd thought about it for a while. You remember that the land didn't fail you. The land just is what it is. You misread it, or the funding ended before you could read it properly, or the window was too small. The land doesn't owe you a success. She looked at the clay patch. You keep going because stopping doesn't help the land. I wrote that down. I've gone back to it several times since. On the Thursday of that second week, two things happened that I will put down in the order they occurred because the order matters. First, Eulalio's granddaughter, whose name was Marisol and who arrived in a late-model SUV with a professional bearing that made the windswept flatland look slightly surprised to see her, came to the property and spent 4 hours with a hand auger and a water table gauge, and a set of reference maps she'd brought from her own library. Second, Nadia got a call from Ernie Delacroix. He'd heard through someone at the county assessor's office, these things travel, that she might have found water on the Mescalero Flats parcel. He called to ask if she needed equipment. He has a backhoe, Nadia told me, standing with her phone in her hand with that carefully controlled expression. He said he'd bring it out free of charge. The man who sold you the goats for $2. The same man? She looked at the phone. He said she stopped, restarted. He said his grandfather used to talk about a spring on the flats, said his family had looked for it twice and never found it. She paused. He said if she found it, it was only right that the equipment that helped open it should be his. I didn't write anything for a moment. Sometimes writing feels like it would break something. When can he bring it? I finally said. Monday, she said. If Marisol's assessment is positive. We both looked toward where Marisol was working, crouched over the auger bore with the focused attention of a person who has been trained to read what the earth says and believes what she reads. She'd been at it for 3 hours. She hadn't said much. She had, however, begun to hum something very quietly to herself that I couldn't quite catch, a pattern of notes that was too structured to be random. At 4:17 in the afternoon, she stood up from the bore, took off her gloves, and walked back to where Nadia and I were standing. She looked at Nadia, she looked at the bore, she looked back at Nadia. It's 8 feet 4 inches down, she said. The flow rate from the preliminary bore is about 4 gallons per minute, which is, for context, approximately twice what a standard residential well needs to be considered viable. She paused. It's not a trapped pocket. There's pressure behind it, active recharge. She looked at the mountains. The formation suggests this is fed from the western slope aquifer, which means it's been there, continuous, just confined, probably for centuries. The wind moved through the mesquite. The arbitrator stood 18 yards away on its chosen ground, doing nothing in particular with the satisfaction of something that had been right and known it all along. Nadia didn't say anything for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, okay. Just that. The same word she'd said when the probe first came up damp, 7 days ago. The same careful, contained okay of someone who is experiencing something too large for the usual containers of language. I looked at her face, and what I saw there was not triumph. It was something quieter and harder to name. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying a belief that no one else could see for a very long time and has just been told, by someone qualified, by a bore in the ground, by 4 gallons of active, pressured, ancient water per minute, that the belief was real. I wrote 1 sentence. She already knew. She's been knowing this for 8 months. What changed is that now the world knows it too. Monday arrived with high cloud cover and a wind from the northwest that had changed temperature and character from the week before, less flat cold, more sharp, carrying a smell that was almost metallic. I noted it when I pulled off the county road. Nadia was already there. So was Ernie Delacroix. I'd imagined Ernie from his earlier presence in the story, the $2 goat transaction, the backhoe offer, as a large, weathered man with a direct manner. The reality was closer to medium-sized and visibly uncomfortable. He was in his mid-50s, a rancher from the look of him, canvas pants, broken-in boots, a face that defaulted to squinting from years of sun even when he was standing in shade. He shook my hand with a grip that conveyed he didn't know quite why he was there beyond a sense that he needed to be. I watched him and Nadia interact for the first few minutes. There was a particular kind of social awkward space between them, not unfriendly, but not warm either. The space of 2 people who have a shared history through a transaction that was unusual enough to sit between them like something unresolved. She treating the animals okay? He asked me quietly, while Nadia was talking to Marisol near the bore site. She watches them like they're instruments, I said. I mean that literally. She's been tracking their movement patterns for weeks. He grunted, then even more quietly. Those 50 weren't ones I was going to manage to save on my own. I knew that when I asked her. A pause. I called her because she'd asked about the land when it came up for sale, 6-7 months ago. She called the county assessor's office about the inactive allotment status. My contact there mentioned it to me. He looked at the goats scattered across the pale field. I figured if anyone was going to do something with that land and those animals, it would be someone who cared enough to make a call. I wrote he gave her the animals because he'd been paying attention. She accepted them because she'd been paying attention. The whole thing started as two different people noticing the same piece of neglected land. The backhoe had been brought on a flatbed trailer that Ernie maneuvered into position with the competence of someone who has been doing exactly this for 30 years. Marisol was directing the approach to the bore site with technical precision. She'd marked a 4-foot clearing radius around the bore and a specific approach angle to minimize vibration to the formation below. Ernie listened to her without visible impatience, which I noted because in my experience of field work, the patience of equipment operators for scientific specifications varies significantly. My ex-wife was a hydrologist, he said when I mentioned it. He didn't say it with particular emotion, just as an explanatory fact. The excavation took most of the morning. I should describe what it looked like, because it has stayed with me in a specific visual way. The backhoe working in careful passes while Marisol and Nadia stood at the marked perimeter, both of them watching the removed earth the way you watch a slow reveal. Each pass brought up a layer of the land's history, the hard caliche surface first, then a band of compacted subsoil, then the pale clay formation that Eulalio had identified as old channel material, and then, at about 6 feet, a change in the color and texture of what was coming up that made Marisol put her hand up and ask for a pause. She went into the excavation and crouched in the bottom, pressing her fingers into the wet subsoil. She stood, she looked at Nadia. She said, 2 more feet, go slow. Ernie went slow. At 8 feet, 2 inches, 2 inches short of Marisol's bore depth estimate, the bucket of the backhoe broke through something. I felt it more than heard it. A change in the sound of the machine, a slight shift, and then, I am not embellishing this, a visible, immediate change in the color of the earth around the excavation. Dark, spreading, wet earth where there had been pale, dry clay. Water moving upward through the disturbed material. Stop, Marisol said. Stop the machine. Ernie killed the engine. The only sounds were the wind and, very faintly, something that took me a moment to identify. Water. Moving. In the excavation. Not the sound of water poured in from outside, the sound of water arriving from below, finding the space that had been made for it. Nadia didn't move. She stood at the edge of the cleared perimeter, and she looked into that excavation, and she was absolutely still. I was watching her face and not the excavation, because her face is what I will remember from that moment. The expression was something I can only approximately describe. It was the expression of someone who has been told they were wrong, and wrong, and wrong, and has held on anyway, not out of stubbornness, but out of a certainty so deep and quiet that it couldn't be argued with, and is now watching the ground itself demonstrate what she knew. It is a very particular kind of vindication. It doesn't look like triumph. It looks like exhaustion and grief and relief all at once, and if you've never seen it, you might mistake it for indifference. Marisol pulled on waterproof gloves and went back into the excavation. She worked carefully for about 20 minutes, clearing material from around the water emergence point, taking readings, recording. When she came back up, she had a small sample container of water and a notebook full of numbers. Active emergence, she said. The pressure is consistent with what the bore suggested. The water is clear. I'll send a sample for testing, but visual and smell characteristics are good. This isn't contaminated surface water. She looked at Nadia. This is a viable spring. She held out the sample container to Nadia. Nadia took it, looked at the water inside. Clear in the white plastic container, the way clear water looks like nothing at all until you think about where it came from. What do we do next? She asked. Her voice was even, professional. We case the bore, Marisol said. We build a proper surround to keep the emergence point stable while the surrounding soil reestablishes. We test the water monthly for the first year, establish the flow rate across seasons. It'll vary, but the pressure suggests year-round viability. She paused. We also file with the State Water Rights Office. There's a process for springs on private land, not fast, but straightforward. How long before it's functional, before it can actually be used? For what purpose? Irrigation, the land. I want to start a restoration planting this spring. Native grass species, some mesquite management, maybe perennial ground cover if the moisture level supports it. She was ticking through a list that she'd clearly been running in her head for a long time. And the goats, they need proper water access. Right now I'm hauling in from a tank. Marisol looked at her for a moment, then looked at the excavation, then looked back. 3 months for proper casing and stabilization. Another month for water rights preliminary approval. So late February, early March. A pause. In time for spring. Nadia looked at the sample container in her hand again. That works, she said. Eulalio came out 2 days later, when the initial casing work had been done and the bore was secured, and there was, if you crouched near the perimeter and put your hand close to the ground, a detectable coolness and faint moisture in the air. He walked the property boundary again, slower than the first time, tapping his cane. He looked at the secured bore site. He looked at the water that was, now, visibly holding in the bottom of the cased excavation, a dark pool that caught the afternoon light. "How deep did you say?" he asked Nadia. 8 feet 2. He nodded slowly. "My grandfather used to say there was a spring on the flats that the Apache families used before the homesteaders came. He said it was lost." He tapped his cane on the ground beside the bore perimeter. "I looked for it twice. In the 50s, when my family was still running cattle. Again in the mid-70s, when we thought maybe water rights would be worth establishing." He was quiet for a moment. "Both times I looked in the low ground, the obvious place." "The obvious place was the lens," Nadia said. "The trapped pocket, it gave you moisture but not a spring." "The spring was upslope," he said. "I didn't know to look there." "You needed the goats." He made that same not quite laugh, not quite agreement sound. 50 goats for $2, he said. "That's the best surveying contract I've ever heard of. I want to write about what happened with the land itself over the following weeks, because I kept coming back, more than I'd originally planned, more than the commission required. And the changes were real and measurable, and to me, deeply strange in the way that slow processes made suddenly visible are strange." Nadia began what she called preliminary restoration planting around the bore site while the casing was still being completed. Not the full-scale work she was planning for spring, just seed broadcasting, careful hand-planting of some native grass plugs she'd grown in small containers in a space inside her truck's covered bed. The stuff of professional land remediation, translated to a one-woman operation with limited resources. But the goats had already been working. This is the part that I couldn't have predicted when I arrived on that Thursday in October. 43 acres of goats over 8 months had done something measurable to the ground. Not dramatic, not visible from a distance. But the caliche crust, that hard white skin that had made the land resistant to any infiltration, was broken in hundreds of small places where hooves had worked it and mouths had cleared the dry fibrous scrub. The organic matter from the grazing, the droppings, the disturbed root systems, had begun barely to change the soil structure in those broken zones. Marisol noticed it before I did. She was doing a soil assessment for her own records, about 2 weeks after the spring opening, and she called me over to look at the infiltration test she was running, essentially pouring a measured amount of water into a marked area and timing how long it took the ground to absorb it. "In a representative caliche zone," she said, pointing at an undisturbed patch of ground, "absorption time is approximately 4 minutes per half-liter. That's essentially impermeable. The water runs off before it can enter the soil." She moved to a zone where the goats had been working consistently. "Here," she said, "absorption time is 40 seconds. I stared at her test setup. In 8 months. "It's not magic," she said. "Goats have been used for land remediation deliberately. It's an established practice. Targeted grazing. She didn't know she was doing it as a formal technique, but she was watching the right things and putting the animals in the right places, and the result is," she looked at the stopwatch, 40 seconds. I looked out at the field, at the goats doing what they'd been doing since October, moving across the pale ground, grazing, pawing, standing in their particular spots, making the land slightly more permeable with every pass. "She bought them for $2, I said, "and they've been working the land for 8 months. "Yes," Marisol said, although I'm not sure bought is the right word anymore. I think she and those goats have a professional relationship at this point. The evening before I drove away from the flats for the last time, at least the last time that felt like active field recording rather than return visits, I walked the property with Nadia. The light was doing what November light does in New Mexico, going gold and then apricot and then a deep, quiet red along the horizon, and the mountains catching the last of it so that the whole western sky had a color you can't quite describe to someone who hasn't seen it. The arbitrator was standing on its particular piece of ground, which was now, I noticed, about 4 feet from the bore site perimeter. It had relocated slightly when the excavation happened, moved, seemed to recalibrate, moved back. It was standing with its head slightly raised, doing nothing, being certain. "What happens now?" I asked. "The water rights process is moving. Marisol's colleagues at the university are interested in the formation. Apparently this type of confined spring on former allotment land has implications for some regional aquifer mapping they've been doing. So I'll have help with the technical documentation." She walked slowly along the edge of the depression, which had already changed. The center, now that it wasn't holding the false moisture of the clay lens, had dried and firmed, but the edges were subtly different. Vegetation, small, cautious, but there. The planting goes in March. I have seed commitments from 2 native plant nurseries. One of them donated a portion when I explained the project. And money. I got a small grant from a regional land trust, $800. Combined with what I had, it'll cover the spring casing materials and the first planting round. She looked at the bore site. Marisol's team will do the ongoing hydrology assessment as a research project, so that cost is covered. A pause. I still need about $600 to finish the perimeter fencing that'll keep the goats in the restoration zones and out of the new planting. Is that going to happen? It usually does, she said. Not fast, but it does. I wrote, she says this the way someone says it who has learned that resources follow conviction. Not quickly, not easily, but follow. We stood at the bore perimeter and looked at the water in the dark pool below the casing. In the red evening light, it looked almost luminous. I thought about what Marisol had said, continuous, just confined, probably for centuries. The water in that pool had been moving through the rock below us for a very long time. It had been there under every family that had tried and failed to work this land, under the homesteaders who'd burned through the topsoil, under the 3 cattle ranchers who'd given up, under the inactive allotment period that lasted decades. It had been there when Nadia's grandmother was alive, when Eulalio's grandfather built his home 6 miles away, when the Apache families who'd known the spring before any of them had names for it gathered around this particular wet seam, in a particular flat expanse of land in the Mescalero Basin. Tsalagi would have known about this spring, I said. I think so, Nadia said. I think the place that remembers water might have been a specific statement, not a general one. She was quiet for a moment. I think she knew there was water here and couldn't get anyone to listen, and then she was gone and the knowledge went with her. A pause that I didn't interrupt. And then I found it, or the goats found it, or I found it because I was listening to her the way I should have listened when I was young. The red light was going. The mountains were turning from apricot to gray. The first stars were getting their footing above the eastern horizon. "What are you going to call it?" I asked. "The spring." She didn't answer immediately. I wasn't sure she'd heard me, and I didn't repeat it. Then she said, "I'm going to call it Tsalagi's spring." Another pause. It was always hers, I just helped it remember that. I drove away from the Mescalero flats in full dark, the heater running and my journal full. 57 pages, more than I'd written in the field in years. In the weeks after, I wrote up the formal documentation that Grady Polk had commissioned, a straightforward land assessment record with hydrogeological notes from Marisol's team appended. It ran to 14 pages and read, as field records are supposed to, clinically and precisely. But I kept the personal journal separate. I've gone back to it several times. I go back to the specific day, the November afternoon, the backhoe engine going quiet, the sound of water in the hole, the expression on Nadia's face, the sample container in her hand, the arbitrator standing on its chosen ground with the satisfaction of something that had known all along. I think about Ernie Delacroix, who gave away 50 animals because he was paying attention to who was paying attention. I think about Eulalio Chavez, tapping the ground with his cane, carrying 60 years of this land in the memory of his hands. I think about Marisol, who drove out from Albuquerque because her grandfather called her, and who has since incorporated Salagas Spring into a regional aquifer mapping study that, the last time I checked, had implications for water access across 1,100 square miles of the Chilarosa Basin. And I think about Nadia, standing in a cracked, pale field on a gray October morning arguing with a goat. Losing the argument, and then pressing her palm against cool clay and beginning to understand exactly what she'd been led to. The last time I was out there was in early March. The planting had gone in 2 weeks before native grasses, some Apache plume, a scatter of grama seed across the zones where the infiltration tests had been most promising. The bore was fully cased and functioning, a small pipe running to a trough that served the goats, and via gravity-fed hose line, a first experimental irrigation zone to the east of the spring site. Green was happening, not dramatically, not a meadow, not a transformation montage version of recovery. Just the specific, quiet, almost invisible green of native grass in its first tentative gesture toward an environment that is beginning to be able to support it. You had to know to look. You had to crouch down and look closely at the pale ground to see the thin blades pushing through the broken caliche in the zones the goats had worked. I crouched down and looked. Then I stood and looked at the land around me. 43 acres of degraded rangeland, limited viability, with a spring at its center that had been there for centuries waiting for someone to listen to the animals that knew where it was. The arbitrator was nearby, as it usually was. It had been grazing in one of the restoration zones, working its way across the broken ground the way it always had, purposeful, unhurried, committed. It stopped a few feet from me and raised its head.